Vladimir?
The gear's ready.
You guys?
Ready.
Saddle up then. По коням. Same old story, huh? You save the world while sitting waist deep in shit and nobody gives a damn.
Subcategory number 6 deals shortly with the practice of racism in man's ancient history. It either shows that it's a very widespread idea, old as man himself, and that has shaped man's history profoundly, and that hasn't gotten rid of yet, or alternatively, that racism is a part of man's nature, and that racism has not walked along with us, but instead been within us, in our nature, for as long as we have recorded our human history. The problem with history is that the vast majority of individuals weren't in contact with people of other races. Another problem is that most people were illiterate and couldn't leave their thoughts behind for the future world to discover. And a third problem is that their language either were too complicated for scripture, or that their method of writing, such as using sharp objects or the material they used to write on, such as stones, were unpractical and limited the opportunities to write. Even ink and paper limited these opportunities, as the color of ink fades away with time whilst paper wither away. Despite all of this, we have been able to discover evidence left for the afterworld to learn from. Get prepared. It's time to do a little time travel. And let's see if we can find some racism in history. Okay, I want to do this as quickly as possible. English is my fourth language, so I'm going to stutter a lot. Sometimes I'm going to make grammatical errors, and I'm going to mispronounce it. But please be patient, and use the pause button a lot. Now, if you want to find more information, there's the book Race: The Reality of Human Differences. However, I went on to Google to find other examples of racism in history. Now, first of all, this might not be a good example, but an example could be the little mixing that has been going on around the globe. If you look at haplogroup maps or mtDNA maps, also the places where there has been mixing, there's arguments for why this is. Usually men went out by themselves, without their families or wives, and to ease their sexual frustration they raped or they just had casual sex with no, which does not indicate that they saw those women as equally beautiful. It might just be sexual frustration due to there being lack of their own women. Having said that, let's go on. Let's begin with India. We know the Aryan invasion is true because in the upper castes in India, there's a lot more light-skinned persons with a European phenotype. And it's not strange, because scientifically it has been discovered that the upper caste Indians has a more disproportion of European genes. And here you can see some differences between the Aboriginal Indians and the Aryan invaders. And the Aryan invaders set up a racial system called the caste system, or the color system. And in the Vedas, Bhagavad Gita, and so on, you can find a story of the origin of India, the racial wars between the Aryans and the Dravidians, essentially. This dates back several thousand years. Then we have the Greco-Romans. You have the Virgil's Moretum, where you essentially talk about the racial phenotype of Africans, how they look like, how they differ. The Greeks also viewed themselves as superior. The Romans called the black slaves Sema-like, and so on. And they depicted themselves quite differently from the sub-Saharans. It's not just skin color, it's really phenotype. And in the stories, the heroic stories, their Greek heroes were usually more light-skinned and had blue eyes and lighter hair and so on and so forth. In Egypt, you have the Egyptians depicting themselves quite differently from their enemies. And they even have canes where they grip their enemy, they have shoes where they walk on the enemy. It's really hostile towards their enemy, and they are very careful to show the racial phenotype. And they also set up a stone, I think it was at Semna, Sensuret III, or the third, set up a stone where he essentially talked ill about the Nubians, or the black man. And the Egyptians also saw themselves as superior. A stone at Semna, where he said essentially that blacks weren't allowed to go beyond that stone into Egypt. So it was essentially the first, what is it called, apartheid, I don't know. Then there's the great hymn to Aten, which speak about how in the known world to Egypt, all the peoples around it had different natures, and it can be discovered in Akhenaten, Amarna, and in this tomb here. Let's go on to China. Okay, so there's an old ancient poem about the origin of the human races, which is quite racist. Then in China, Eastern Europeans, called the Tocharians, moved into northwestern China. And what's interesting is, and was found 2 scrolls found at one site, turned out to be in previously unknown Indo-European languages, now called Tocharian A and B. So look up those scrolls if you wish. Now, here's where it gets interesting, I think. They depicted themselves quite differently from us, and they also called us monkeys, or they compared us to monkeys. Because of our hairy, white, ruddy skin, and our prominent noses, which the Chinese likened to those of monkeys. And similar to the Romans' use of the term Semas, monkey-like, to disparage black Africans, another example of groups seeing its racial features as being the ideal, and those of other groups as not fully human. Now, what's interesting is that the Han Chinese applied the term Hu to barbarians like the Yuezhi, that is us, who had deep eye sockets, prominent noses, and beards. But they did not apply it to another barbarian tribe, Qiang, because the Qiang looks more like themselves. We, or us Suesi, were viewed as being a part of a very different stock, not only barbarian, but ugly and Mongol-like to boot. So because of phenotypical similarity, they recognized that there was something different with us, despite that we were both of our tribes were barbarians to the Han Chinese. In the Bible, you can also find a lot of racial quotes. The Bible, of course, and the Quran and the Torah are quite old, very old. Also, what's interesting is that the people, in order for people to accept Jesus as their Lord or whatever, they usually wanted him to look or resemble like themselves in order for them to accept him. That is quite interesting, and a display of phenotypical preference, I suppose, or in order for them to have more trust and associate, they wanted it to look like themselves. The Assyrians depicted themselves quite differently from the Nubians, so they too were aware of the differences. The Arabs has a lot of saying about the black people. They also treated the white slaves a lot better. Then we have ancestral religions, where in Asatru you have Rigstulan, like the Indian caste. It was a hierarchical racial system, I suppose you could say, based on phenotypical, where the lighter you were, the better you were. This is discovered in Asatru. Asatru is also a folk religion, and same is, and these are examples of ancestral religions. And the same can be said about the Native American religion. As you can see here, an example of God is red, or how they want to keep their reservations, for themselves. And the same goes for Shintoism in Japan, which also is an ancestral religion, where they worship their forefathers. And then we have the Native American and European contact. Well, as you probably know, the Vikings went into North America, and there they set up the Kensington Stone, and I believe there were another rune, not really sure, but there were warfare there. The Vikings didn't, they traded some, but they weren't on friendly terms per se. The Vikings used a racial derogatory term called skreiling to describe the natives, meaning weakling, or it could also be interpreted as gnome. It was not positive. It was a racial derogatory term applied to the Native Americans, so they were obviously making a distinction there. Now, the Native Americans also ambushed constantly the Vikings, to the point where the Vikings had enough and left. Because, I don't know, they didn't want intruders, I suppose. Then we have the Aboriginals. When Captain James Cook and Joseph Banks went to Australia, they met the Eora, and the Eora weren't friendly. They were quite hostile to these newcomers, and
slowly make your way out to the lodge.
Give me no trouble, my boy.
The most interesting thing, I think, is the Bushmen. And the reason why I think it is most interesting is because it's the earliest, right? Now, the Khoisan people in Africa do not look like the sub-Saharan Western Africans. They look more like Orientals, as can be seen here. And they're aware of that. And they have quite interesting language. It's not very sophisticated, but they usually make three distinctions. A is edible animal, like warthog, giraffe. Inedible animal is African, European, and hyena, meaning Oma. So we're considered as equals to hyena. And then persons are Sioux. Now here's where it's really interesting. The first time the Khoisan saw Orientals, they called the Orientals Sioux, not Oma, like they call us Europeans or other Africans, because they recognized the phenotypical similarity. So because of phenotypical similarity, we are in a group along with inedible animals, and they are in the group of persons and humans. And it might say, so if they think that way, then why shouldn't our very early ancestors think that way? Another example could be the Neanderthal.
Two human species are going head-to-head in a battle for survival. Strange hunters, and also deeply wary of them.
We're so used to seeing strangers. You can go out, go to work every day, you're going to see hundreds of people that you've never met before. These people didn't have that experience. They maybe met strangers a few times in their life. How would you react seeing someone who was very close to you, but at the same time different? They had no world view of that.
They disappeared within a few thousand years. Was this coincidence or conquest?
The Neanderthals did very well in Europe over many, many millennia of changing climates and different conditions, and the only truly new thing was the appearance of Homo sapiens.
Sooner or later, they were bound to come face to face. The first encounter between two almost identical human species is a profound shock.